Hello, beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, joined today by Fróði of Skansa Forum and Guide to Culture, and very happy that it is so. Before we get started, the topic of our discussion will be when nationalism goes international. And I look forward to speaking with Fróði about it. I'll introduce him in just a moment, but I do want to do my open channel opening shilling first. Please do follow this channel, Semiagog. You can do so on BitChute and on YouTube. There is also Minds, there is Gab, there is Twitter, there is, God help me, Parler. So you can follow the channels there. There's also Safer Space, the sister channel here. And what else? There's GoFundMe and there's Subscribestar. And there are also my books, which I must shill. This is a science fiction book set in a dystopian future, Istanbul, in the year 2076. It involves a story of a book thief going after a rather unusual book. There is my collection of poems called Cinders from the Bloomery of Youth. You can find that on Amazon as well. The one is under Oliver Perrin. The other one is under Oliver Timken Perrin. And I think, dear friends, that covers the basic shilling. I'm going to ask Fróði to introduce himself, but before we get to that, I did want to say one of the main reasons I wanted to have him on is that his second channel, which is Guide to Culture, or his channels, sets of channels, you know, across different social media platforms. His second project, let us say, Guide to Culture, is something that he started at probably the worst possible time as regards the, well, I shouldn't say that. I think he was around before the COOF, but he really got rolling with a Decameron Film Festival, and he was kind enough to have me on for that. He did that during the worst of this COVID period, and it's just a terrible time for people starting channels on YouTube. And so when I've gone over to BitChute, very often he migrates his content off of Guide to Culture over to on YouTube over to BitChute once he's finished doing live streams. And I'm like, this guy has to have more subscribers. He simply must have more subscribers. He's got great guests on and discusses any number of interesting things, a lot of relatively big names for these circles. And so I thought to myself, if nothing else, got to drive more subscribers over to his content on BitChute and YouTube. I'm sure he will introduce himself in just a moment, but you can find Skansa Forum at Skansa Forum, SCANDZAFORUM, if I'm not screwing that up, over on Twitter. And there's at Real GTK, that's at REAL_GTK over on Twitter. And there are, of course, channels that correspond to that on YouTube and BitChute. So for the people who view my channel, definitely go to his Guide to Culture and Skansa Forum and subscribe. So yeah, but obviously, Fróði, you should be allowed to introduce yourself. Perhaps you can start by telling us a little about yourself for those who are not aware of you and what you're doing. Maybe a little bit about how you ended up in this world and, you know, how you came to this, and then say a little bit about these two projects, Skansa Forum and Guide to Culture.
All right. Well, thank you so much for that. And thank you for the kind words. Of course, yeah, we got to know each other during the start of this real lockdown earlier this year when I had the Decameron Film Festival. I started the Guide to Culture channel actually in October 2018, but I just did sporadically, did an episode here and there. I didn't really get going until, just like you said, the Decameron Film Festival during the coronavirus lockdown. And then I had a lot of guests on, and that's when the channel took off and I started creating regular content. My name is Fróði. I was born on the Faroe Islands. And the Faroe Islands, for those who might not be familiar with that place, probably have viewers from all over, and the Faroe Islands is a tiny, tiny little place, and I don't blame anyone for not knowing about it. It's a set of 18 islands in the North Atlantic, and it is a part of the Danish kingdom, and it is a rainy, windy place out of a I don't know, Lovecraft story, basically. It was founded in the 800s by Norwegians during the Viking ages. So Norwegian Vikings, you could say, it was founded at the same time as Iceland. So it's two countries founded at the same time. Also, Orkney was settled at that time. And for historical reasons, which I won't go into, it ended up under the Danish kingdom later. And the Faroe Islands is still a very much ethnically homogeneous place. It is not really part of the multicultural project in the same way as Sweden and Norway and Denmark. But when I was a child, I moved to Sweden, and immediately I saw a huge contrast. On the Faroe Islands, you can still today, you don't have to lock your car, lock your out front door on your house. It's still very much a high trust society. There is basically no immigration except for lonely men, lonely fishermen importing Thai wives, women from Thailand and the Philippines, that kind of immigration, and adoptions, etc. But not this kind of mass immigration that you see in the rest of Scandinavia. When I moved to Sweden as a child, like I said, I saw a very immediate contrast, and that has become even more obvious now, of course, because things have only gotten worse in Sweden. And Sweden is often held up as an example of a failed multicultural project. And what I saw was not only that immigration and mass immigration had started, but also a different attitude, because you still have, and you still had, at least when I was growing up, a more traditional framework, a more traditional mindset on the Faroe Islands compared to Sweden. And I was immediately alienated, I have to say, by the Swedish mentality and the Swedish culture. And as I grew up, this instinctive reaction grew into a political awareness. And I realized, getting older, I realized that I'm probably part of the last generation that grew up in a society that I would call somewhat normal, because the generation that's growing up now, the people growing up who are teenagers now and in their early 20s, I have friends who are in their early 20s, and they have asked me and they've talked to me about this, that when you grew up, Sweden was still very much a Swedish country. Now it isn't. And this has been a huge contrast. And in many big cities and in many areas, neighborhoods, Swedes are already a minority in those neighborhoods. And when I grew up, we had a handful of Arabs in the school. Now you can see school photos where the roles are reversed, where you just have a handful of Swedish students scattered around the classes in that school. So it is a very dramatic change that has happened very quickly. And as all of you will probably know, it's also something that has been covered up. So the power structure, the elite, if we call it that, have not been honest about what's going on. The mass media, the political elite, and the financial elite. We can get into those details later, but this is an issue that hasn't been discussed. It's been silenced. It's been swept under the rug. And the people who have tried to talk about it have very much been silenced. And this is something that I just couldn't live with and just ignore. So I got involved. Over 2 decades ago. Can you still hear me? Yeah, okay. I got involved over 2 decades ago. And at first, it was more of I participated in events, and I wasn't a visible figure, a public figure. It's only in the last few years, since 2017, I'd say, that I've become a more visible and public figure. And when in 2017, well, actually in 2015, I started organizing conferences in Scandinavia. So I started organizing conferences in Stockholm. I had Kevin McDonald, Greg Johnson, Ricardo Duchesne, Mark Webber, other guests on. I've had Guillaume de Rocher, I've had Mike Enoch, I've had the Golden One, I've had Mark Collett, I've had Jared Taylor, F. Roger Devlin. I've had the sort of who's who list. So the Scanza Forum started, it wasn't called the Scanza Forum in 2015. The name came in 2017. It was started out as a more private thing. It wasn't publicly announced. But in 2017, we went more public with the whole project. And it started out inspired by the London Forum, the AMREN conference, etc. The reason I started it is because, and this is sort of a mantra that I always repeat, that humans aren't rational creatures. We aren't machines. We don't just analyze data and information and statistics and arguments. We are social creatures. And we need to live and be active in a social environment and interact with other people. And really, when the elites or when our political opponents disagree with us, they don't give us counter arguments or say, have you read this paper or have you seen this argument? No, they try to attack us on a social level. They try to cut us off from our social environment, try to harm us financially, put pressure on us in a sort of it works through conditioning, right? Rewards and punishments. It isn't through rational arguments. It is on an emotional, social level. And that's why we need to have a social environment of our own so that we aren't as vulnerable. And that's also when we meet and interact with people, with real people. I think that's a game changer. I can talk more about that. I can talk a lot about that because I think that's very important. But just by way of introduction, that is how it started in 2017. And in, like I said, 2018, I started this channel, Guide to Culture. And the name is taken from a book by Ezra Pound that came out in the 30s, 37, I believe. And we talk mostly about films. We've made many, many episodes about films, both popular films and more obscure films. But we've also started talking more and more about books and philosophy. I'm doing a series of episodes called First Principles, where I go through the fundamental literature of the right, the fundamental ideas that inform the right. And I bring on different guests appropriate for each topic. So that's really what I'm working with now. And like you said, we're on YouTube and we're on BitChute. The archive is on BitChute. And my website for Guide to Culture can be found on guidetoculture.org. Now, culture is spelled Kulchur. So it's Guide to Culture, but culture is spelled in an eccentric way. And I guess I've not been very helpful to my followers with the two names of my projects. The Scanza Forum and Guide to Culture aren't really, shall we say, intuitive ways of spelling those words. So yes.
Yeah, in one case you have a K and the other a C, right? For the same sound.
Yes,
tricky.
Indeed, yes. Indeed.
Well, thank you. And again, I really recommend anyone, most of you have probably heard of Fróði and what he's doing, but for anyone who hasn't, there just really is Scanza Forum, the channel, at least on YouTube for the moment, seems to be lying fallow, but Guide to Culture, all kinds of great stuff rolling through there. I particularly enjoyed an episode that was a discussion with Ricardo Duchesne, but there are many of them that I've enjoyed. And I really appreciate the fact that you keep asking your French guests if they have any evidence of particular groups having anything to do with the French Revolution, because I've been trying to find out about that for quite some time. So I'm like, yes, ask everyone, ask everyone. Let's find out what we can. Well, on this, I've mentioned that we sort of have this theme of nationalism in an international context. And I chose that because it seems to be a central aspect, certainly, of the Skansa Forum project that you have underway. If it's not the central aspect, it's certainly a central aspect of it. But it's also a part of the Guide to Culture project, simply because of the variety of guests you bring in from different countries. And the whole idea of nationalists cooperating on an international basis is one that interests me. If you're just sort of approaching this instinctively, it seems a little odd, because you'd imagine that each person or each group of peoples, all of these folks would focus primarily on their own nations. However, the first thing that occurs to me is that you have the difficulty of something that is starting, at least, a recent phase of it has begun. And there is always sort of the weakness at the outset of a project. And at that time, I think there's quite a bit to be gained from cooperation, getting everyone together who is aware and interested in pushing something forward along these lines, and trying to, make the most of what you have available. And that seems to me to suggest that there could be something quite prudent about doing things internationally in terms of nationalism. I very often see channels that start out, in the UK, and a lot of Americans will get interested in it, vice versa. People from Europe and the United Kingdom and the rest, or Australia, New Zealand, getting into a channel that's in the United States, and that lends some weight of numbers. Before the algorithm got tipped and everything, it could help to push things forward. And so, and this is a rather superficial level, talking about what sort of follower count you have in social media, but it is a place that matters. It is an arena for communication. So, there are a few things that occur to me right away where I say, there does seem to be quite a bit of good sense involved in taking a look at nationalism on an international basis. But it does raise all sorts of questions about how nationalists can be expected to cooperate, particularly internationally, because, if you imagine different nations having a resurgence of their own identities and cultures and the rest, you can imagine tension being produced because it's latent in so many contexts, particularly, in Europe, though obviously elsewhere as well. And so that's one angle of this. And on the other hand, you've got this sort of cat herding aspect of nationalism, where you have a lot of people with strong personalities. If they didn't have those strong personalities, then they probably wouldn't have pushed their way up into a public position at a time when that sort of thing is most certainly not rewarded. So it's kind of like the nature of the landscape. You've got people who are used to saying, no, fuck you. I don't care what you think about it. This is my position and I will say it. And when you put those people together, and often you can have sparks fly and have colorful exchanges. And the last little bit here is that, very often the people who are into nationalism, how do I say this? I think many of the people who seem to be most offended just by the value neutral ideas of cosmopolitanism, of international travel, of international dialogue, a lot of those people are perhaps folks who have not had the opportunity to develop a real sense of the value in those things. The charms of being able to meet people in different countries, eat good food, talk about new ideas, see how other people look at it. There's a lot that that gets belittled in national circles about that kind of international dialogue, because obviously it's been turned to ugly purposes in many cases. But that's another aspect, I think, that maybe is there that's a problem. So to start with, maybe you can tell us a little bit about how a nationalist should, or at least can, operate internationally. It seems you must have given this thought, because the Skansa Forum in particular, you have so many guests from different places. Many of them have quite different views, and it seems that there are probably some challenges, and I'd love to hear more about them, in terms of getting these people under one big tent, as they say.
Yeah, I definitely have had to deal with that question, but I think that for most people in at least Western Europe today, it is just taken for granted. Nationalists in France don't have a beef with nationalists in England or in Germany. I don't think that that is a real threat at the current moment, because we're all aware that we're facing a difficult situation. In Eastern Europe, they still have a lot of border fights. There's a lot of conflicts between Hungarians and Romanians, for example, many countries in Eastern Europe have hostilities between them. But I think those conflicts will also become less and less relevant when they start to face the same problems that Western Europe has. I think it's important to talk about white nationalism as an idea, because many people will question, well, white nationalism, what is that? Why is that relevant? Isn't that just an American idea that, well, because in America, people came from all countries in Europe and they became like a new ethnicity in America, and that's when you can talk about people being white or not white? Well, not really. Is relevant everywhere. White nationalism is simply understanding that it's difficult for Denmark to remain Danish if Germany turns into Turkey or Iran. The whole point is that we're in this together, and we have to be concerned about what happens to all of Europe, because it concerns all of us. That doesn't mean that I want Sweden to turn into Italy or Spain or Portugal or Hungary, or vice versa. I don't want Italy to turn into Norway or England. It doesn't mean that the differences between the countries aren't important. It means that if we allow a genocide against white people to happen in South Africa, that influences our view of ourselves and our interests and how we should behave. Because it's just a fact of the matter that no one talks about. I'm talking now about the mainstream discourse. No one talks about the problem of Kenya being too black. No one talks about that. But people talk about the problem of Sweden being too white, or some administration in France being too white. It's too little diversity. It's just a fact that this happens only to white people, only to white countries. And we can only deal with it as a totality, because we can't deal with it only by focusing sort of myopically on a small area just where I live. No, I care a lot about what happens to America and to England and to Spain and to France and to Italy, although I don't live there. So that is simply what white nationalism is. It often gets mischaracterized as, well, as long as you're white, that's okay. There's no difference between white people, and everything should just be amalgamated into one big sort of white mass. That's not what it means. It means simply that, yes, I am Scandinavian, but in addition to that, I'm white, and I live in a context, I live in a bigger world, and what happens to the rest of Europe, it impacts my part of the world and my part of Europe as well. So we have to care about that. When it comes to organizing people together, like I said, in Western Europe, that's basically not a problem, because everyone, I've never had any experience with people discussing that, well, someone is from England and they don't want to have anything to do with nationalists from France because of they had wars in the past, or the same thing with Germany and England, etc. At least not among white nationalists. There are these quote-unquote civic nationalists, as they're called, who care about which state they belong to rather than an ethnicity. But that is a different thing. That is a different thing. That has to do with citizenship. They define their nationality according to citizenship, so that a Somali who has a Swedish passport is just as much a Swede according to that point of view. Now, in Eastern Europe, like I said, it's still a problem, but Eastern Europe is sort of 15 years behind, maybe 20 years behind the development in this respect. That's been going on. Lucky them, yeah. Unfortunately, I hope they're not going to make the same mistakes, but it looks like at least in some parts they're starting to make those mistakes. One issue is, of course, one conflict is Russia versus its neighboring states. They have real, authentic conflicts, but there are Russians living in Ukraine, fighting on the Ukrainian side in that war, for example. It's not clear-cut. It's not black and white. I'm just saying that in Eastern Europe, with regard to Russia, for example, and Lithuania, there is animosity between them. And Lithuanian nationalism is, unfortunately, from my point of view, I'm not telling them what to do, but unfortunately, Lithuanian nationalism is sort of defined to a large extent by its anti-Russian sentiment. And in the Baltic states, that is the case, but less so in my experience. For example, in Estonia, their nationalism is not as much defined by the border conflicts with Russia, for example, because they are more concerned about not getting the same trends in their country as they see in Finland to a lesser extent, but to a greater extent across the Baltic Sea in Sweden, because they are in that area and they see very much what's going on. And they see Finland as a warning example of what can happen with the EU and the European integration project, and Finland sees Sweden as a warning example. A friend of mine even talked about Sweden as the European Christ, in the sense that Sweden will be sacrificed on the cross so that other countries can be saved, because Sweden will be a warning example. This is how bad things can get. But I have to say that over the last few years, at least over the last 5 years, but maybe 10 years, I think we can say that maybe the UK and in some respects America have taken the lead in implementing a ideology and a totalitarianism that has gone beyond what Sweden has done. So I think there are many countries, France, Germany also, competing for the number 1 spot as a bad example of a failed multicultural project. So yeah, many countries are going down the same. It's the only difference is the speed and the time frame, but the same thing happens all over Europe, except in Eastern Europe. Some of them are seeing the trends and they have nationalist parties. For example, we have friends in the Estonian parliament and in the Estonian government who definitely protest against what's going on in Europe, and they're a part of the EU. The same thing, of course, with Viktor Orban in Hungary. He has very much. He got a question. This was a couple of months ago. Some journalist asked him, "Do you still want to see a westernization? Do you want to see a westernization of Hungary?" He said, "No, I don't want to. Parallel societies based on mass immigration in my country. I don't want that." So many countries in Eastern Europe are starting to see what's going on in the West, and they don't want to make the same mistakes, at least not all of them. So we hope that that can somewhat turn the trend, and hopefully we can see the good examples in the East and see that, well, these people have some self-respect. Maybe we should also have some self-respect. So I guess that's the issue with organizing people together in events, etc., over national borders. So of course, there's the added difficulty, for example, of Jared Taylor, who has been banned from the Schengen area. Most people watching this probably know the story, but he was going to my conference in Stockholm, and he was stopped in Switzerland and turned back. He had to stay a couple of nights, I think, in a sort of arrest. Was detained there and then sent back to America, and he's banned for several years from the Schengen countries. And
that was supposedly Poland that was behind that?
Poland,
right?
Yes, exactly. So because there is no real border control between Schengen countries, so there is no passport control between Schengen countries. If you get into one Schengen country, you can easily travel between all the other Schengen countries. And so if one member country wants to ban a person from entering their country, they have a right to ban them from all of Schengen, because if they get into some other country, it's easy for them to get. So, for example, if Jared Taylor went to Sweden, it would be easier for him to get into Poland. So they just banned him from all of Schengen. It's used as an excuse, based Poland, right? They also banned Richard Spencer, I believe. He was first banned from Hungary and then from Poland, and they've banned other people as well.
And there was a whole bunch of drama involved with Greg Johnson and some Antifa folks and the rest surrounding one of your conferences. Maybe you can touch on that as well as an example.
Yes, this is a very, very, very interesting example. And this is an example of totalitarianism. I've contrasted this with the open society. So we have the idea of an open society, right? That is the identity of many countries in the West. The political paradigm of that Western mentality is, of course, George Soros, and he has an organization called the Open Society Foundation or something like that, right? And it's inspired by Karl Popper, the political theorist Karl Popper, and his idea, which I think is very sound, is that more important than the right to vote every fourth year, as is the most common time span, more important than to be able to put a vote in, which sort of doesn't make any difference. More important than that is the ability to criticize the elites in power or criticize the ideology in power. And that's what distinguishes an open society from a totalitarian society. In a totalitarian society, the elite in a country, they know best and they just implement their ideology, and the masses, the people, should just shut up and obey and and do as they're told, and they shouldn't object too much. They shouldn't criticize too much. And if you can't have an open discussion, it doesn't matter if you're allowed to vote, because you can't discuss the issues and you can't get the right information to base your voting decision on. So I think that's a very sound, actually, objection. But the point is that in many Western countries, we are prevented from discussing these issues, and it's especially this replacement level mass immigration that's going on in Western Europe. We're not allowed to discuss it, and this is the biggest lie of our times, because the media and the political elites, they will say that it doesn't happen. This isn't going on. It's just a figment of your imagination that this mass immigration is going on. They will not even admit that it's happening. We're just imagining that our neighborhoods or our schools, that we are becoming ethnic minorities in our neighborhoods and our schools, and we don't recognize our own countries anymore, and we feel alienated. That's just a figment of our imagination. But yeah, we're not allowed to say no to that. And this rule that we're not allowed to say no to mass immigration, this is enforced by the financial system, by the economic power. This is a thing we talked about in a previous podcast just earlier last week, I believe, with F. Roger Devlin, that in the modern mass society, you can't only talk about the power being in the state. You have to, it's more complex than that, because societies today are so huge, they're so massive, they involve so complex structures and so many people, that you have to talk about three major branches of power. And that is the managerial state, that is the economic power, the huge companies and the banks, etc. And the third is the organizations of culture and communication, the mass media. Now, all these three branches will silence you. The state will have unfair laws that will hit. So, for example, other races are allowed to insult us, are allowed to attack white people, are allowed to say bad things about us generally as white people. That's okay, but we can't do that back. So it's asymmetrical, right? The financial system, we saw just earlier this week, I believe, that both Laura Towler and Mark Collett lost their bank accounts, their private bank accounts. That's one example of how you're being hit by the financial system. You can lose your job. We don't have any job protection that protects us from being fired from our job for our political reasons. The third, of course, is the mass media. That's the most obvious, because they will talk about race being a very important thing when George Floyd died, and because those police officers were apparently very racist. There's no evidence for that, but they will emphasize the racial aspect. But they will not emphasize the racial aspect when it comes when the roles are reversed, right? So in Rotherham, in church burnings in Europe, in gang rapes, they will say that race is completely irrelevant. Information will have that angle, right? So, and there are, and of course, many people, if you speak up about this, if you become a public figure, I've been slandered in the mass media numerous times. Many other people have also been slandered. They put pressure on you that way. Now, in Norway, this is a very, very interesting example of what went on. Because a couple of years ago, the Norwegian Police University, the Police Academy in Oslo, they published a report about right-wing extremism that should be combated by the state. And they use words as right-wing extremism. They defined as extremism was the willingness to use violence. And this is supposed to guide police work, this report. And it was edited by a gentleman at the university called Tore Bjørgo. And after this, and I was mentioned, the Skansa Forum was mentioned. Of course, we have never advocated violence. Greg Johnson has given an entire speech speaking out against right-wing violence. So it's beyond any question that we have never advocated violence, so we cannot be defined as right-wing extremists according to that definition that the police uses. Right after this report came out, which was a scandalous report, on the cover was the blown up government building after the Breivik terror attack, and it was like a huge guilt by association that's really harmful for everyone mentioned in the report, including myself. I want nothing to do with those things. Of course, I was horrified by those terror attacks, but the government is releasing a report making these accusations of guilt by association in that way, and making it a police matter, making politics a police matter. Right after that report came out, this editor, or the head of this report, the guy responsible for that work, Tore Bjørgo, he talked to the Norwegian newspapers, and he said that it was a nice headline. When the police, so the Norwegian headline was "Det hjälper när politiet banker på dörren" eller något sånt där. In English it would be that when the police knocks on doors, it helps when police knocks on doors to silence quote unquote hate speech. And hate speech is that you say no to mass immigration. That's hate speech, right?
Yeah, hate speech is anything that is not mandatory is forbidden. Anything, it's the yes.
Exactly. And what happened right after he said that this police knocking on doors is an effective method to combat hate speech, that is, people saying no to mass immigration. Right after that, the security service in Norway started knocking on doors. They started going home to people who had no criminal involvement in anything. They just were normal people who said no to who were politically, they weren't even publicly politically involved. They were politically interested people who maybe ordered books from somewhere or participated in an event like my own, like the events that I organized. So the police started knocking on doors. And just that in itself is just a political intimidation technique where the state elite uses the police as a political thugs to intimidate the political opposition. That's the only way you can see it. So that's a silencing method. And that is the opposite of an open society. That's not a part of the police's job in a civilized Western country. It shouldn't be that to silence political opponents. And right before the Skansa Forum in Oslo in November last year, a sort of left-wing extremist, shall we call them, a blog published a post implying that Greg Johnson supports terrorism. Anyone actually researching the topic and actually reading what Greg has said on the topic will see that Greg has written a dozen articles speaking out against right-wing terrorism. And the previous speech he gave right before this one at the Skansa Forum in Stockholm was titled Against Right-Wing Terrorism. That was after the Brenton Tarrant attack in New Zealand. He gave an entire speech about how bad that was. So in no way can you accuse him of supporting terrorism. And no one supporting terrorism would be welcome to speak at my events. I wouldn't invite them to speak. That was used as a rationale, that was used as an excuse to arrest him at the conference. And when they arrested him, the security service, we have the document from the security service because we got it through Greg's lawyer in Norway. We have the document, the official document. It's published on Countercurrents. It says that the rationale behind his arrest is to stop the alt-right and quote-unquote identitarians from gaining a foothold in the country.
That doesn't sound neutral at all.
It doesn't sound neutral, and it doesn't sound like any of the police's business to stop political movements from establishing in a country a political voice for a certain message. And I mean, they don't make any distinctions between different kinds of what is identitarian, what is alt-right. Of course, everyone knows that this just means that these people, that the people who are supposed to be silenced are the people saying no to mass immigration. The people saying that, no, we want ethno-states or whatever, those are the people supposed to be silenced. And no one can accuse Greg of being violent or advocating violence or anything. But I think that is probably the clearest example we have of a state, in my experience, a state explicitly saying that they have given their police force a political mission, a political task of intimidating or silencing. I mean, I call it intimidating. They don't call it that. But I think that when the police starts knocking on doors, as the writer of this report, Tore Bjørgo, as he said explicitly in an interview with the media, and which happened right after that, they started knocking on doors. I think it's very clear that when that happens, people will be less likely to speak out, because many people will feel very uneasy when the security service comes knocking on the door. And it should be added that in all the cases when this happened, that I heard about, because it happened to people that I know personally, the police were always cordial, they were always polite, they didn't arrest them. They just wanted to, I mean, this is the experience that everyone reported, that everyone told me about, is that they just got the feeling that the police wanted to send a message that we're keeping an eye on you for your political views. That is the experience that they reported to me in any case. And I think that when the police start sending a signal like that to people peacefully speaking about their political views, that has an intimidating effect. So that is why I call it an intimidation technique, because most people, I'd say over 90% of people, will be uncomfortable enough when that happens to say, okay, maybe I'll just stop talking about politics.
And the ones who see no problem with this at all, the ones, for example, who believe that this is a legitimate use of police forces, which, as far as I understand, should be based upon scrutiny of behavior, right? The actions of police should be directly related to behavior, because, you cannot have a cause of legal action, for example, of arrest or of a prosecution, whatever, without a fact. Yeah. And a fact sounds a lot like an act, because they must occur out here in the real world to be something that registers on that scale. Now, I'll grant you, I don't support it, but the idea of endorsing violence, that's perhaps one of the borderline categories. But as you have so clearly expressed, that wasn't at issue here. But what's so ironic is that the very people who are so willing to jump in and talk about how there's nothing objectionable at all about this are the same ones who will tell you that, and I'm not taking a position either way, I just think it's, illustrating, it's illustrative of the hypocrisy, which is, so much in evidence on all sides. They're the ones who'll tell you that if you attempt to initiate a consensual relationship with someone in your workplace who's to whom you are senior, that's an absolutely unacceptable form of pressure and coercion, because you're senior in the workplace. And, even though the person might not tell you that they feel pressured in any way, the simple fact that you have that seniority throws the entire relationship into question. Even if, for example, you have a person who's like, no, I just decided I wanted to date my boss. Again, now I'm not taking a position on it, but the hypocrisy is just, foamy mouthed and wide-eyed. And that seems to be the case all over the joint. I caught some of that business with Greg when it was happening. He got picked up. I do recall that happily a notable lawyer there in Norway got involved, and if it weren't for their help, perhaps it wouldn't have gone as well as it did. I mean, obviously, it was a huge imposition on Greg, and affected the conference and people speaking and all the rest.
I could add also that, if I may, that right before that happened, like I said, so the conference was on the Saturday, and on Thursday night, this left-wing blog that is sort of a, shall we say, a hope not hate-ish kind of blog in Norway, they published this article about Greg, and I said immediately that, okay, this is probably going to be used in some way. This is not going to end here, because what usually happens is that when they have something that lacks credibility or lacks seriousness, it will first be published on some silly blog, and then it'll be quoted by a more credible source, and then more credible sources will quote that other source, and then it becomes a real mainstream media thing. And of course,
Flex call that snowballing. It's like an accepted technique across the world. Yeah, snowball it into something.
Yes, exactly. And that's exactly what happened here. And I said to Greg, they're spreading this rumor about you. This is very dangerous, because no one wants to be associated with terrorism, and no one wants that reputation to be out there that he supports terrorism. That's an awful thing, and that can really harm you. And I said, they're probably going to use this. And very correctly so, on the morning of the conference, the police came in and the media started writing about this. So what I said already 2 days before the conference is, you should put together a short reply, just pointing out how this is completely contrary to all the facts, because like I said, every time something like this has happened with a right-wing terrorist or right-wing massacre or whatever you want to call these things, with crazy people like Brenton Tarrant or other people attacking a mosque or a synagogue or whatever, Greg has actually written an article publishing this with like describing and going through the details of why he objects to this kind of behavior and how this is very bad for not just moral reasons, but also for political reasons. This is not the kind of society we want. So I just, you should be ready with something, because when it comes out in the mainstream media, then it becomes a real danger. And so that's why when he was arrested, we already had a reply that we sent out to the newspapers, and that way they couldn't just run with this narrative, right? So they were basically forced to let him go because they arrested him on false grounds, on completely false grounds. They had no justification, and they were basically gaslighted. Well, at least that's one way of seeing it. That
plausible deniability, right?
Plausible deniability, exactly. The security service was gaslighted by this these sort of left-wing blog into arresting him on false charges. Of course, many people have suggested that they work together as well, and that there is some evidence to indicate that they have worked together in similar ways before. So, but I'm not gonna state anything that I can't prove.
Right, but well, you're a much better man than I am there, because I love to state all sorts of things as speculation I can't prove, but I'm not asking you to, certainly not. But one thing I'm curious about, does Norway have the same sort of newfangled and oh so fashionable requirement that, for example, many precincts in the United States have, certainly that is very popular in the UK, where they require college education in order to become a police officer, which seems to be just the most perfect way of ensuring ideological compliance?
I'm not sure what the requirements are. I mean, there is a sort of a college education. I think it's like a 2-3 year education to become a police officer. I'm not sure about the details about what's going on there. No, but yeah, these documents that these academics are publishing in these, in the police university, the researchers, the that's also another funny aspect, that this institute in the police college, it's called CREX, and it's the Center for Studies on Right-Wing Extremism. It's not political extremism; it's a center for studies on right-wing extremism. I mean, so already in the title of the institute at the college, you can see where this is going, right?
Surely you know that they're the only ones that are dangerous. I mean, they're the only ones that we have any reason to be concerned about.
Yeah, exactly. Of course, the only violence that has happened in connection to Scanza Forum conferences is when left-wing extremist mobs have tried to attack our attendees. So,
yes, and there was some of that I saw as well.
Yeah.
It was that in Denmark?
That was both in Copenhagen and in Oslo, so both in Denmark and in Norway. Yeah.
Didn't one of those affect Laura Towler, if I'm remembering correctly?
Yes, that's true. That's in Copenhagen. That was about 3 weeks. So we had these very close, in close succession, these two events. And the one in Oslo, in Copenhagen, this mob attacked people. They attacked the catering firm trying to deliver food to the venue. They attacked people trying to get into the venue, and the police just stood there. They didn't remove them.
They completely refused to remove them from blocking. Yeah.
Yeah, because they say they also have freedom of speech. So their freedom of speech includes physical intimidation and attacking, being masked, spitting on people, attacking a catering firm. That's their freedom of speech. We don't have freedom of speech. We can't even speak. We get accused of being, criminals if we just say anything. So yeah, that's the
the mixed set of standards. Let us say the heterogeneous set of standards. Yeah, in one case, behavior doesn't matter in terms of law enforcement, and in the other case, ideology is what everyone focuses upon. For all that they, there's just so much crap going around about that. I mean, if I were in security services, the first thing I would do is demand to get good information. I mean, and that's what, more than, well, I shouldn't say more than anything else, because there's so much evidence of hypocrisy and let us say scumbaggery. But one of them is that you expect a certain standard, like someone who is involved with anticipating potential issues, like an Anders Breivik shooting or something, for example, which all of us quite sensibly would want to see avoided, and prevented, prohibited. You would imagine that those people are accountable. Like there will be people who come in behind you and they check to make sure with very, very sharp pencils and magnifying glasses to make sure that the chain of command stuff was right, that people were informed, that there was no dropping of duty. And yet somehow no one has said, I'm sorry to phrase it this way, but you have shit for information. Your information is shit. It's entirely in question. It's like being fed false information from an enemy. Of course, that's from my perspective, but at least from the perspective of law enforcement, they should be able to say that, this is a highly biased party, and so it calls this stuff into question, and let's make sure. And it's the absence of that time after time. You get to a gate, so to speak, and how things could go. There's a fork in the path, and at every forking path, there's always the selection of a particular direction. And, I guess at a certain point, you have to say, don't piss down my back and tell me it's raining. There's just a point at which everyone should realize it. Now, I have a number of questions. I don't want to cut you off on the background of this because I think people should know about it, and it's all the better that people be made aware that it's going on in general and in particular to people like you, to Greg, to Laura, to Millennial Woes, all sorts of people. But I do want to ask a couple questions about the nationalism stuff, but I'm sensitive. Not only did I start late, I should also ask, how much time do you have? And that will allow me to
on as long as you like. I'm not in a hurry.
Well, then, slap Thor's hammer down on the table when the time comes. If you're getting tired of it, then one thing I wanted to ask you about is this idea of white nationalism. At the outset, you said it's very often misconstrued, and it seemed to me that you were underscoring the fact that it's a domain for cooperation. It is a domain that it is useful. It is a domain that is useful in terms of recognizing identity, but it is not, and it's a basis for all sorts of discussions. We can take a look at linguistic groups, right? There need not be any political dimension to taking a look at sets of language groups across a territory or across a period of history. You don't look and say, well, we can't talk about Indo-European languages because that will be political and will suggest, for example, that we can't have these separate countries because, really these two languages are so closely related. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the Western Germanic languages and Dutch and stuff, and we're going to combine them with German, and it's all going to be one country. I'm belaboring the point, but there are ways to use study and discussion of unifying factors as well as ones that distinguish in ways that don't have to be political. And so I take your point when you talk about a white group. There's easily the advantage of being able to talk about and recognize that whites are a global minority. And a simple knowledge of that fact, you can hear anything from like 9% to, 12 or 15% at most. Simple recognition of that fact is important because it underscores yet again a whole nother set of Russian nested dolls of hypocrisy. But it does seem to me that at the same time that there's a lot that's useful in that, and we don't have to get into discussions of whether it arrived with colonial projects like South Africa or the United States, where you sort of had to take this group as being a group because in comparison to indigenous Indians or black slaves that had been imported, it is actually a group. We don't have to get into that. However, and again, there is no doubt value in that approach. However, I wanted to get your impression, again, along the lines of this theme of nationalism versus internationalism, or more properly, nationalism going international. What have you seen in terms of ways that might be being manipulated? Now, I don't know a lot, for example, about Alexander Dugin. And because I don't want to say anything negative about him, just straight out of ignorance. That's not to endorse him either. Maybe he should have negative things said about him. I'm just not qualified to make those observations. a Eurasian project that is pushed out through channels of discussion and consideration that are broadly considered white nationalist would seem to be a unifying project. And for a country that straddles Asia and Europe, uniquely so, in the case of Russia, that's an interesting place for ideas like that to come from and then be spread throughout the quote unquote white world. Again, not making any claim about this. I'm too ignorant about it. But it does occur to me that things like, people like to talk about Kalergi plans or the clear trajectory of the European Union. There does seem to have been a process over quite some time that's all about trying to get rid of all these fault lines that exist within what we've now come to call white people, and particularly in Europe, people will be like, oh, these terrible world wars, they can never be allowed to be repeated. It's so awful. It bring us to the brink of destruction. We must avoid World War III. So meet your new black boyfriend. That situation is something that we're all aware of. We've seen that trajectory. So I wanted to ask you, again, not making any claims here, but you've looked at the international scene. Can you see any ways in which it may be or could be, conceivably, that this idea of white nationalism as an overarching category could be turned to nefarious purposes, so to speak? Let's just say a competing purpose, a less nationalistic purpose than recognition of separate ethnicities, simply because it tends to have the effect of clumping these people together, and that is sort of a foundation point for the further removal of distinctions and integrating whites, if you will, into a larger block. I don't want to raise too much of an alarm about it. Maybe it isn't of concern, but I imagine you're uniquely positioned to deal with it, to offer a comment on it, because you've seen people coming from all over the place and coming together to talk about these things, and so these themes must have come up, I'd imagine.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk about nationalism, I think it's very clear that that white nationalism is not a substitute for nationalism; it's a context for nationalism. So, I mean, I'm obviously, Swedish or Norwegian nationalists. They are nationalists, but they are that in the context of understanding what happens in the rest of Europe, for example. That doesn't mean that they don't care about their national identity anymore because they just care about being white. Some people have tried to make it into that. Some people have tried to suggest white nationalism as a substitute, a sort of imperium idea that Europe should be an empire and sort of erase the borders between or erase the separate identities. I don't really know how serious those projects have been, or if it's been trolling. You can always speculate, right? But yeah, I mean, I think when every serious person in the white nationalist movement talks about white nationalism, it simply means that yes, I'm an English nationalist, or yes, I'm a French nationalist, but I am that as a white person, and I care about what happens in America and Spain and the rest of Europe as a whole. And I understand that our destinies are interconnected that way, and we have to care about those bigger issues. There was this guy Konstantin von Hofmeister rewrote a thing, for example, that we have to mix the Scandinavians with the Spanish, and we have to mix this and that to make it all into just one big. I mean, he's I don't take him seriously. I think he's just a troll.
It seems like you're being rather kind there. I mean, and actually, I shouldn't say this, because there is these days, as insane as everything has gotten, there is this category of people who really are just trolls who want to see what they can get away with floating out there. Yeah. But surely it's worth considering that there are other people whose interests would be served by directing a sense of whiteness in the direction of a unifying force that tended to remove distinctions, right? It would be another step on the way towards uniting all under heaven, right?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, that is the EU project is a step in that direction. I mean, and this is a thing that's been with the EU from the beginning. There's so everyone knows about Caleri, but another founding father of the EU is a French businessman called Jean Monnet, and he talked about the revolution in small steps, because he anticipated and he knew that that the peoples of Europe would never accept their vision of erasing the European nations. People wouldn't accept that, so that's why we need this revolution in small steps. And there's talk of including Turkey in the EU, for example. And there's, you blur the borders, you blur the boundaries between all, you blur the distinctions. So yeah, I mean, those obviously subversive attempts or ambitions from the other side, most definitely, yes, they will use this sort of rhetoric slur that if you're against the EU, you're anti-European, etc. Right? So yeah, those kinds of globalists, these kinds of the people like Caleri, like Jean Monnet, other people, yes, they have had such ambitions. They have wanted to unite Europe because they're rich people. They're globalists. I mean, I think, yeah, there's definitely ethnic cliques. We don't have to talk about them for obvious reasons, for YouTube community standard reasons. But I think also that there is the added factor of just rich jet set people who live in their own world because they're very rich. They don't have to deal with the lower classes. They don't care who the lower classes are because they don't have to interact with them. I think there is a problem when the powerful people are so much richer than the rest of the population that they can live. It's like they live on a different planet, although they live in the same country. So they are not affected at all by their own decisions. So I think it's a very good thing when immigration starts to impact the posh neighborhoods in Sweden, because all of a sudden it becomes a problem. There's this area in Stockholm called Södermalm, which used to be a working class area. Now it's a gentrified journalist, sort of hipster leftist area, right? This neighborhood in Sweden, and many journalists and those people live there. And it's actually a funny, you can follow it basically day by day, that when gypsies, is like these people, these journalists, they've just been mocking the regular old people, everyone who's been worried about this mass immigration, this transformation of their city and of their country. They've just been completely mocked by this journalist class. But when the gypsies started arriving in this area in Stockholm, all of a sudden it became a problem of sanitation. It became a problem of safety. It became an issue, and they use euphemisms all the time. They don't want the metro line to go out into the further districts where the posh people live. They don't want the metro lines to go all the way out there because they want a peaceful area without the metro and all those things. No, they don't want gypsies going on the metro to their area. So yeah, I do think that these extreme class differences, they are a problem. And that is definitely, it's a part of the issue. It's a part of the description. There's no way around that. And when people are so rich that they just travel everywhere, they're ruthless because they can live anywhere, they can buy a house anywhere, and they interact with other rich people. So yeah, the borders, they become less important for them because they're ruthless themselves. So I think there is an ethnic component. I think it's an economic, it's a lifestyle, it's a class, if you like, component. There are many components for why an elite have wanted to break down the borders of Europe and other countries. I mean, it can't be explained with only one factor. That's just impossible, because no historical process only involves one factor. And that's simply the case.
Far too complex a system. And I'll throw another one in there that dovetails with what you were just mentioning about the insulation and the echoes of hypocrisy that always surround it. And that is perhaps just as much responsibility or participation in this should be laid at the feet of the middle class, which is to a considerable extent the willing, capering ape of those they see as their betters. On my mother's side, her family, she fought her way up properly into the middle of the middle class, having sort of tenuously been down at the bottom of it. And in my father's case, he sort of dropped down because his father was a black sheep of a very wealthy family and sort of, fell down and slid into it. And so I have a great deal of experience with the middle class and have, to a considerable extent, had to identify the snobbery within me that comes with it. There's a very distinct, and I imagine if you haven't had your own experiences in yourself, the simple fact that you talk with academics and that you are as well read in, frankly, just a lot of stuff that's leftist thought and postmodernism and philosophical stuff, there's no way that you got that exposure to that thinking and the rest without getting exposed to snotty left-wing middle-class people. And I've had to excise, those aspects from myself, and now I come across them. I'm like, what an odd little artifact that's left here. It's the ingrained snobbery of this middle class that wants to keep its nose up about everyone else, and I just wanted to throw that in because in large part, that middle class hive mind is a frightening and powerful thing in and of itself. But in terms of the international aspect, one of the things I'd love to get out of this is some what they like to call white pilling, some morale, some constructive things that people can carry away from this discussion and do things with. One of the reasons I'm interested in your projects is that, as I said, they're explicitly international. And I think, for my part at this stage, that international aspect is very, very important because we can seem to all be in one place, though it's a mediated experience through the internet. It really is a thing when you can muster some 20 or 50,000 people to show up and do a thumbs down vote on something or to push a message out there. And, in many cases, particularly with a smaller country, how many people are you going to find in Macedonia to push a given message? Now, I don't know really all that much about Macedonia, but a lot of these smaller countries have a shitload of nationalists in them. So the situation may be better than I'm imagining. But the point is that we can come together and help each other in ways that are made permissible by the tech, and that I think are certainly critical, given that this is an uphill battle against. Let's not call them enemies, let's say entrenched competitors. And so in terms of operating internationally, I wonder if there are any kinds of lessons that you have learned about doing these things internationally. Some of the things that come out in the course of our discussion, you can end up with trying to do a conference in a particular nation and you find out that they're really not welcoming at all in ways you didn't expect. Like you find out there's a memo that's been distributed to law enforcement. Other countries, I recall at one point, you were thinking of doing something with Croatia, right? Perhaps other countries are better. And that's just one dimension of it. I think there's also the dimension of what I called cat herding earlier. You've got people with very different opinions, very different backgrounds. You pointed out that you're not likely to see, for example, a Croat and a Serb claw at each other's throats at this point in an international conference context, probably, because everybody recognized that there is a greater threat. But like I myself have seen that there's considerable friction that comes from people who adhere very strongly to the idea that there's one ethnic clique responsible for everything, and those who either flatly deny that, or those who, like in my case, are like, yeah, that's one factor. There's a lot about that I was like, come on, man. And then I look at it and I'm like, interesting. Perhaps there is something there. There are levels to this and a lot of elements. So I brought up that last one because it seems like that's an area where possibly you can run into problems cooperating. I don't have any problem talking to you, but I come across all kinds of people on Twitter who want to butt heads specifically about that subject. And if it's not only that and everywhere that and always that, then you yourself are in question. I don't mean to make too much of that, and I don't want to make it seem like that's an insurmountable obstacle. But I did want to use it to illustrate ways in which there are problems with people coming together. So maybe you can tell us, people who want to do more, how they can do it, what sort of things they can expect with bringing people together internationally. Maybe you can give them some tips for how to get around problems. Basically take your experience and share it. Sacrifice the wisdom like Balder so that others, are in a position to benefit from what you've fought and learned. Because these things like, dealing with Greg Johnson or Jared Taylor being cut off, those are expensive lessons for a lot of people who are just getting their operations started. That could kill the exercise in childbirth, so to speak. So how would you direct folks?
Yeah, I mean, you bring up many important issues. I was actually, when we were, planning this conversation, I was sort of thinking about the issue, taking a lot of notes, but now it's like I took too many notes, so now they're useless because I have too many. But yeah, the thing you said about pointing out one group, of course, is very obvious what we're talking about, but for obvious reasons we can't talk about it. But yeah, that is usually so. Nationalism, white nationalism, has really exploded in numbers over the last few years. What tends to happen, and I've been involved for a long enough time to notice a pattern, and that is when people are new to this and when they discover this issue, they think that they have sort of seen the light, and then they obsess about it, and they think that's the only thing, and then they get angry with people who don't talk about it all the time. I tend to limit. I think it's crucial. I think it's very, very important, that issue. But I tend to limit the amount I talk about it because it tends to attract people who have low social skills, shall we say, that might bring other issues with them. I don't want to focus too much on that. And also, there's another reason why I don't want to focus too much on it, and it's because there's very little we can do about it. I think that we should try to focus on a lot of things that we can influence, and we are more able to influence our own behavior and our own worldview than the group behaviors of others. So yeah, we should be aware of it, but I don't think people should sort of should drown in that issue and not see anything else, or just because the problem is that many people just tend to become paranoid. Okay, so this group, they have all the power, they have unlimited power, they have magical powers, basically. So there's nothing we can do. We can just sit here and feel like victims. That is a very, very big problem. Many people who focus too much on that issue, they have become politically useless. So that is actually a warning example. When it comes to organizing, yes, there are many. Of course, there are difficulties, but there are also very many benefits. One of the benefits is that we can learn from the examples of others. For example, if you sit in a big city, if you are in London, or if you are in Paris, which is very much, to a large extent, a hellhole. I mean, Paris is horrible. I never want to go there again.
The only thing that it is more so than horrifying is really fucking sad. Yeah, but that's like Paris is even beyond. I haven't been to Malmo or anything, but like even more so than Sweden or anywhere. It's just at any given moment. We don't need to go into this, but you look up at the horizon and there's a tire fire, a column of smoke coming from some burning car in the distance.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you're just in that environment, that's all you see. It's, easy for you to just go down a very depressed path, and that is not very constructive, and that isn't really helping anyone. So in that case, it's actually very helpful to go to other places and see what they have going. It's very encouraging for me when I go to Eastern Europe and see how normal it is. It is, it's like going to the Baltic countries today is like going to Sweden 25 years ago or more.
And I should say, I recommend people go and look. I think it's on Skansa Forum, isn't it, Fróði, where you have the interview with the member of parliament?
Yes.
Because it's just like, wow, you're in the office of a guy who's, they're in the government building and perfectly willing to talk to you about all of this. I was like,
yeah, exactly. I mean, this is just normalcy. You can go places in Europe that has normalcy, that we would see as an ideal, basically. I mean, this is the thing. I'm not a utopian. I don't want anything crazy and strange, outrageous. I want a normal country for my people, and we have examples of that. And that is one of the things that leftists will say, that's impossible. That's a pipe dream. No. That's the normal state of every country throughout most of its history has been like that. People aren't normally just inviting an invasion so that they become ethnic minorities in their own countries. That is not the normal situation, and it's not unavoidable. We can just not do it. I mean, it's as simple as that. So yeah, I mean, it can be very encouraging to go to these places and see, okay, there are still normal places, and get some sort of white pill out of it and see that normalcy and an actual life worth living and a future worth having is still available and still possible. And also the other way around, because if the Eastern European countries, for example, if they didn't have the bad example of Western Europe to look at and to see what not to do, it would be far easier for the bad guys to give them the multicultural opium and to fool them into making the same mistakes, because they wouldn't have a bad example to look at. So we can learn from each other both those ways. When it comes to a more general thing that I think that people have to understand is that we are in this, and this comes to a more fundamental issue. And we are this is a spiritual struggle. This is a worldview struggle. This is not a political struggle. This is not a political issue. It is not an issue that is going to be solved by an election or by a 2, 3, 4, 5 year period. What is needed is a paradigm shift, because our entire paradigm is flawed. You can see that by how when conservatives, when they try to virtue signal, when conservatives want to show how good they are, they always appeal to leftist values. They always appeal to the values that their enemies will accept, because they are in the same framework. Our entire paradigm in the West today is flawed, and that is what we have to work with. And that is why you have to understand that there is no quick fix. This is a marathon, and it's a long-term work, and it's going to take probably generations to turn anything around in the West. I'm definitely convinced of that. And I mean, this is an example that I always give is a speech that Revello Oliver, he was a genius. He's one of my favorite writers. He gave a speech in 1968. I'm not going to say the title of the speech because that's probably hate speech just to say the title of it. But he said that if we don't turn this around in 5 years, it's going to be too late. That's how far the rot has gone in America, in his case, of course, but in the rest of the West as well. And in a sense, he was right, because by turning it around, if you mean by that you're going to go back to a normal situation, if you're going to undo the damage, it is too late. So we can't just magically go back to what people thought was normal in the 1950s. That is never coming back. We can't turn back. So in that sense, maybe you have, like, when a huge dramatic change like that happens, maybe you have 5, maybe you have 10 years to turn it around and undo the damage. But not if it's been going for 100 years. And that is the thing that we have to realize, that when we are looking for a solution, that is going to entail a paradigm shift. It's a cultural complete change. And there are so many levels where that is important. And I think that is the most important thing that our people can realize. Because if you, so this is going to be a bit more philosophical, a bit more theoretical, but if you look at paradigm shifts in science, for example, if you are operating on an old paradigm, you can accommodate and you can make excuses for a lot of anomalies, a lot of facts, and a lot of pieces of information that doesn't really fit into that old system. But you will figure out explanations and figure out sort of roundabout ways of fitting it all in.
Yeah, a lot of people don't seem to realize that the Ptolemaic system, before it was superseded by Copernicanism, that's a classic example of a paradigm shift. The math worked. They could make the math work, but it's not like that situation with programmers where they're like, simplicity is elegance, right? Get it simpler, have less drag on it, have a easier, clearer explanation. Occam's razor. But yeah, to your point, those other systems that are involve the wildest contortions can be made to work.
Yes, exactly, and that is why you will see people being frustrated that they try to give evidence. Okay, here is psychological science, evidence for mental differences between races, for example, and then people will say, well, no, that's just a flaw. So and basically the entire social sciences today, their main task is explaining why their predictions don't come true. That is sort of their main task. Okay, we say that everyone is equal. Why does none of the evidence show that everyone is equal? It's because of these and these and these. And they write huge tomes to explain why the results don't show what they're supposed to show. And it's the same thing when you look at it. If we take intelligence tests, I'm not going to get into that because I know it's a forbidden topic, but every single intelligence test shows group differences. There isn't an intelligence test that has shown that, okay, all groups are equal. No. So what is the task? Well, it's very obviously fits into one model that says that, well, there are group differences. Well, if you then have a model that says, well, there are no group differences, then all you have to do, your entire work will be to explain why all the tests show something different. So, but that is the power of a paradigm. That is the power of a paradigm, that no amount of detail will be enough to convince you. Usually what it takes to make a paradigm shift is a generational shift, because if you have accepted a paradigm, it's difficult enough to get people to change their minds on one piece of fact, on one detail. That is very difficult. To get them to change their mind about the entire framework, the entire worldview, is basically impossible. It's almost impossible.
That's a Yuri Bezmenov point, right? About how there's just the whole generation has been wasted because they've been screwed up. Like we have the expression in English, I'm sure you've heard it, a spoiled child. Spoiled doesn't mean spoiled for a little while. Spoiled is an absolute condition, and then you're done. Spoiled specifically indicating you have to start over. And there's an example that is very much archetypal that I got through my friend Tim, and it just is a perfect guiding lamp. He always used to mention it. There's a reason that Moses went off into the desert for 40 years. That was enough time to isolate the group of people and raise 2 generations, which seeded it deeply enough. For example, Mao didn't get as far as he wanted to because he didn't have the number of cultural revolutions that he had intended to. So you get a couple generations, you can reframe it. But I'm sorry, I didn't want to cut you off. I just wanted to underscore what you were saying about the the loss of a whole generation or more.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we cannot emphasize this enough, because many people, when they wake up to these problems, it's a dramatic problem that we see before us. We are soon becoming ethnic minorities in many countries within just a couple of decades. When we talk about younger generations, when we talk about the fertile generations, we're basically already minorities in some countries. I mean, if you talk about the population ages under 35 in Sweden, do we have 5-10 years left until they become an until Swedes become an ethnic minorities in those age categories? I don't know. I mean, this is the issue, that yes, people get stressed out because they think that we need a quick fix, and then they get angry at me when I talk about issues like, for example, a reevaluation of values. I talk about Christianity and I talk about these things. Many people want to go back to Christianity. Well, the reason I talk about these issues isn't because I want to be cruel and mean. It's because it's actually relevant. We have some values that guide our mentality and guide our behavior. If we just take Christianity, for example, what is the main message of Christianity? At the core of Christianity, what is the narrative of Christianity? I don't know if you're Christian or not, but I'm not saying this to make people upset, but they get upset. But the point is that the narrative of Christianity, well, it starts with the Old Testament, right? It starts with the tribal Jewish people and their God. And they are in conflict with other tribes and other groups, and their God even encourages them to commit genocide against other groups, etc. What happens then? The turning point comes with Christianity and a new message. The new message is that we shall give up, we shall transcend this tribal identity. We shall become universalist and individualist, in that sense that our identity is no longer defined by our tribal belonging and our tribal ancestry. Our identity, our salvation comes from embracing an idea. And this is a salvation that we get individually. I made an episode about this issue with Laurent Guyano that I made a couple of weeks ago. We talked about Christianity, for example. And so, yes, that is how salvation happens. And that is the new message that you are supposed to embrace to be a good Christian. And you're supposed to reject your tribal belonging, your tribal identity. And when Christians, traditional Christians, Catholics, when they get upset with Jews today, they do not say that, well, Jews are a tribe and we are a tribe and maybe we should separate or something. We should have different countries. No, they say that Jews are evil because they still have their tribal identity. They should be like us. They should embrace universalism and sort of Christian individualism. Now, what I'm saying is that we are living in a post-Christian era when it comes to religion, but we are still inescapably culturally Christian in the West. Our values about how you are a good person, those values are still there. The value that if you are a good person, you're not tribal. You're not supposed to be that. You're supposed to be universalist. You're supposed to be individualist in a sense. Now,
and the true test, I have to throw this in because I've been working on this same, I mean, everybody's looks at it, has been working on this quasi-religious aspect, these vestigial dimensions of the Christian universalism associated with the soul, etc. But I want to throw this in. I hope I'm not derailing you. But the specific thing is that the proof of universalism, yes, the Christian proof, is to passively and with great patience, glorious patience, in the light of grace, sacrifice oneself as a proof of one's adherence to the universalism.
Yes.
And so the specific aspect there, you talk about a paradigm shift, you talk about things like taking a whole bunch of notes, and now there are too many notes, you can't even use them. There's the old line that I love, I will repeat it until the end of my days because there's great wisdom in it. It goes, I would have written you a shorter note, but I didn't have time. If you can distill it to a shorter note, then you can get the message across, right? Like a Nike, just do it, you know. I've been looking for a shorter note to encapsulate what you're talking about, and what I'm talking about. I think also with the business of the proof of one's true commitment to universalism, and nothing less is acceptable, is the willingness to die for it, and particularly in the Christian context, passively. Because I've talked about this before in the past. When you say martyr in Arabic, shahid, it means one who bears witness. And martyr also has that dimension in its etymology in the English word, one who bears witness to this truth. But the difference is that in the Muslim religion, you can bear witness to the truth of God by waging jihad and killing your enemies. So someone who dies covered up to his elbows in the blood of his dead enemies is, in a Muslim sense, a martyr. And he's borne witness to it. But the uniquely Christian aspect is the passive willingness, I mean, spiritually active, you could say, but physically passive aspect of acceptance of your fate. And so to bring together that, as well as the idea of a shorter note, I've been trying to discover it. And there are two lines that keep echoing in my head, and perhaps they can help to usher in a paradigm shift. One is that the only acceptable response to attack is suicide. And that seems to encapsulate the entire ethic of this post-Christian, business that we've been suffering under. The other one is that the limits of universalism should be marked suicide. I draw the line as regards universalism at the point at which any adherence to it mandates suicide. And that, I think, ties into what you're talking about with the business of Christianity and its vestiges, despite the fact that we live in the post-Christian environment, as you said, that core sort of instinctive, I won't say instinctive, but religious response is still very much a problem.
Exactly. So, I mean, this is the thing, and this is very, very important. If people try to sort of diminish that point, I think they're making a huge mistake, because this is very important to how we see ourselves. That is why people experience some sense of cognitive dissonance when they go against the universalist narrative or the individualist narrative, because it's so deeply ingrained in our culture that it's not even seen as coming from Christianity anymore. It's seen as objectively right. It's seen as objective because it's been so impactful. And this is what I'm talking about. And we can see it in, like I said, when people converted to Christianity, that entailed that they gave up their tribal identity. They went through ritual desecration of gods, their old gods, of statues, and they gave up that identity, and they became a part of this bigger movement. And of course, Christianity started out as 100% Jewish. I mean, it was just a part of Judaism. It was a branch of Judaism. It was like the Reformation in that kind of split, right? In Judaism, that one part of Judaism retained their tribal identity, and another part embraced this universalist aspect. And it was overwhelmingly Jewish for a couple of centuries, and then it became the state religion and the Roman Empire. So this ability to convert others, it gave it a powerful competitive advantage. It made it able to expand very quickly, become very powerful. So it started out as 100% Jewish. Very quickly, Jews became an ethnic minority among Christians. And by the year, by the 1500s, all of Europe was Christian. And now whites are a minority among Christians. That's how quickly it expands, and that's a part of its nature. And the fact that individualism and universalism, they just go hand in hand. They are two different aspects of the same thing, because if you think about it just a little bit, you'll realize that if you are just an individual, you are not a tribal. You don't have a racial tribal identity. Then you, as an individual, have the same moral obligations to people in your own nation as you do to someone in Kenya. So a German has the same moral obligations to a random Kenyan as he has to a random German, if he is an individual. So there is a universalist aspect and there's an individualist aspect. And I think this can be best illustrated in the fact that in the entire West, we have two valid options in politics. And that is international socialism and, for lack of a better word, liberalism. And these two political options that are available, acceptable, morally acceptable, of them, they just emphasize one of the aspects more than the other. So we have liberalism that emphasizes individualism more, and we have international socialism that emphasizes universalism more. And this is the spectrum you are allowed to choose between in the current West, and that is how important this paradigm is. So I do believe that the liberal revolution, if you like, has happened within the wider paradigm of Christianity. And I do believe that international socialism has also happened within the moral framework, within the moral paradigm of Christianity. And that is why this is such an important and such a crucial element to address. Because if we don't analyze and look at our own values, our own core values and the framework of values, no amount of presenting this or that detail will work, because it's just going to be rejected. That is why, there are so many people who have worked for decades on producing the right statistics and all the crime data and all the racial differences in mental abilities and in crime rates and etc., and trying to present all that, but all that just bounces off people who hold a narrative that says that if you're a good person, you're supposed to be universalist. You're not supposed to be tribal, because it is on a subconscious level, you're just not supposed to be tribal. And we have to become aware of that. And that is a huge problem, because I think that evolutionarily speaking, we evolved in tribes. Humans are tribal. We are biologically hardwired to be more comfortable around people, more similar to ourselves. J. Philip Rushton called this genetic similarity theory. There is evidence to indicate that spouses have some genetic similarity that makes them more compatible. Even friends, pairs of friends that they've tested for genetic similarity, there's also a correlation there. And just harmonious societies, if there's more in common between people, if the nations are more homogeneous, it'll bring more harmony. And of course, in a more quote unquote diverse society, well, we're seeing right now what's going on with the Black Lives Matter and all of that. People are biologically hardwired to be like this. And we can only get a normal, good, functioning society when we embrace that fact.
Yeah, and there's certainly there are aspects of what you're talking about with the let's say the legacy of Christianity in some respects. I don't want to go chasing like a dog barking after a car as regards Christianity. There's a lot that is our shared heritage, and I'm sure you know all of this too. I'm not saying as though you don't. But what's of most interest to me, assuming that one does make the link in the chain and recognizes that universalism and aspects of this individualism came in, I would argue, and you'd probably agree, that we had aspects of that heroic individualism with the idea of demigods and other things, but the pure universal aspect of that individualism comes down to the interchangeability of the soul, this essential element, and each one is, of value in the eyes of God. But I think that there's quite a bit about the way in which, on the one hand, those basic ideas have been weaponized with malice aforethought. And then on the other hand, and we're getting a little bit far afield here, but I'll throw at least this piece out. And on the other hand, they've developed after a fashion because of the sort of unconscious trajectory that we just talked about. And there's a very interesting book. It's called Why the Arabs Are Not Free. and I would recommend it to you very highly. It's by a communist from Egypt named Mustafa Safwan, who escaped from Egypt, went to France, and he became a student of Lacan. And he wrote this book, Why the Arabs Are Not Free. And the basic idea why they're still enchained is because they've got this particular textual system. I don't have to go deeply into it, but the basic idea is that the Christians underwent a Reformation. And subsequent to that, though people don't talk about it explicitly, the Jews underwent a Reformation. And this is more my thinking here, extrapolating from Safwan, but they certainly did. And that Zionism itself is essentially the secularizing Reformation and post-Reformation movement for Jews. And that out of the Abrahamic religions, that the Arabs themselves, and Muslims more particularly, I should say, did not undergo such a reformation and have not to this day, which is why they've been put in the crucible and so much pressure has been brought to bear on them, because they're the last of the Abrahamic religions that has to have its spine broken. And that the reason that has not yet happened with them is because they still hold Quranic Arabic as the standard written form. And, so you have mutually unintelligible shit, like over in Morocco, you're going to hear one kind of Arabic. In Syria, you're going to hear another. And while both of them can read Quranic Arabic, their languages are in many respects mutually unintelligible, or almost. And so the one thing that holds them together is this body of literature. And what happened, of course, in the West is that we had, like the Tyndale Bible, and there are others, these people who wanted to develop Christian holy texts, translate them into the vernacular so they'd be accessible to everyone. That has that's a natural progression of universalism, right? Get it away from the priestly caste. And it was central to the whole Protestant aspect, right? That you no longer needed someone in between who was going to intercede with you for God. It was the direct communication between the individual and God, and that the translation of the holy books into the vernacular instead of just in Latin, that facilitated that process. So there's a breaking of it and a democratization of the knowledge. And I think that is a central part of this whole process of flattening it, and we eventually arrive at this universalism that has had the sacred dimension sort of chucked out. You can talk about the business with Marx saying, for example, we're going to take Hegel and turn him on his head, dialectical materialism rather than these, Platonic idealistic games. And it seems to me that out of all of this, we have a new, I've even talked about it in another clip. We have a new crucifixion, but instead of the cross, we call it the intersection. It's the intersection of intersectionality. And we have like a brutalist sculpture pinned to that crucifix of intersection, a sort of universal everyman. And that's also an every woman, and gender must disappear as a necessity in this eidolon in the mind's eye. Sexuality must be completely amorphous, protean, and ever-changing. It's all races, it's all peoples, and all of them are interchangeable one into the other. I can choose to be a girl today, I can be a boy tomorrow, I can dispense with all such categories the next day. I can be a Rachel Dolezal or whatever, like a Sean King, and I can just transform this protean figure of this, and in my mind's eye, it's a gray brutalist commie sculpture on, instead of a cross, a giant intersection. And that to me seems to be what we're faced with. And so how do we, to come back around to nationalism, how do we get from this mess, this monster that has been released, that has been driving forward for so long with this theme of individualism that has nothing at its core, that confronts a heart that is relative. That's kind of like your Stirner thing, Max Stirner, that then goes to Nietzsche saying God is dead, that morals are arbitrary. How do we get from that back to something solid? How do you have rank and hierarchy without a standard? And what it seems to me, I'll shut up now, that the universalism is the natural place that we've arrived at, quite unnaturally, as a consequence of attempting to find something that fits in all circumstances as the absolute standard and rule. And all that we found is that there can't be one. That, you know, universalism somehow brings us to relativism. And so how do we return to a point of orientation, particularly given, you know, and maybe this is the best example, that we've got nationalisms, you know, that are independent with each of their different nations. How do we come together with something as a standard and point of orientation other than universalism? Because any point of orientation that would have to work in all of these cases, if it's not going to be relativism, it would have to be universal. You see how we're caught between this like Charybdis and Scylla of universalism, which we desire for some reason, quite sensibly, because we want an absolute standard. And yet, in order to apply it, we find that there's a little pop-up Jack in the Box that's relativism, laughing. You know, you wind it up, here's your universalism, and boom, up out of it comes relativism. Like, how do we get reoriented? How do we put a stake in the ground? How do we fix this? This small ask, no pressure.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're moving in that direction anyway. I think it is. So there are many factors here why I think we're going to move more and more in that direction. Okay, first of all, I don't believe we're ever going to end up in some utopia where everything is just peaceful and nice, but I think we're going to start moving in a more sensible direction for many reasons. One reason is that the opposite side is that it's sort of revealing itself as obviously crazy, as obviously insane. It's dropped the mask of sanity, of pretending to be sane, and it's just become a clown world. And I've often said this, that when you had intellectuals, Marxist intellectuals like Marcuse or like even Chomsky, I mean, I think he is very second-rate compared to even the earlier generation of leftists, but even then, they had some sort of credibility as intellectuals, as sort of gurus, as leaders, and intelligent people were impressed by them. No one is really impressed by the left and the people driving that agenda today. They're seen as quite insane. And if you just compare, and I've seen this, of course, because I have a couple of decades of experience, I've seen a bit of a trajectory in how the right has looked and how it's worked. And it's started out, I mean, in the 90s, it was definitely subcultural, and it was like a few people, of course, like Jared Taylor were already active back then, and etc. But very few of those, a lot of kooks, a lot of weirdos. Now we have very many very intelligent people, and less so on the left. I mean, I use this dichotomy, everyone understands what we mean by that. And you'll see that, like I said, all their predictions were false. They were wrong about pretty much everything they've said. Whereas you can go back 100 years and look at a guy like Lothrop Stoddard and see that he was right about practically everything he said. And those things have effect. So the more intelligent people will, of course, realize that more and more. Another factor is a spiritual factor. I think that in a world that is more and more nihilistic, people become more and more desperate to find something meaningful. And the fact of the matter is that no matter what our sort of ideology of individualism and universalism, meaning is arrived from understanding that you are a part of a bigger picture, that you are not an individual, and that you cannot find meaning and satisfaction, a deeper satisfaction, from satisfying your own personal, immediate needs and sort of self-gratification through whatever of validation online or buying products or anything like that, or even intellectually. I mean, it's that's not how life is fulfilling. Your life is fulfilling when you understand that you are a part of a greater whole. The individual here is an abstraction, because the individual cannot exist by himself. You are already, when you're born into a tribe, you're born into a family, you're born into a historical context, you're born into friend-enemy distinctions that already exist before you're born. You're just born into them. That is a part of your identity. I think people will realize that we, I mean, on the right, people who have this historical vertical, if you will, this vertical thinking, we have something to offer that is infinitely more valuable than the sort of trivial, merely sort of temporary worldly perspective or paradigm that the other side has to offer. That is another factor that I think is hugely important, because, I mean, I've done this for a long time, and no matter what they throw at me, I would never, ever, ever go over to the other side or sort of just pretend that, oh, I'm just an individual, I'm just going to do trivial shit now. No, I mean, no matter the cost, no matter the personal cost and sacrifice, this is just more fulfilling. This is just more meaningful, because I'm living as a part of a greater whole, of a tribe, of a people, and I'm living not for myself but for my ancestors and for my descendants. That's what I'm living for. I'm not living for myself. People will realize that that's more fulfilling, and I think, it's just, generally speaking, when people get older and they understand more about what's really important in life, they start researching their ancestry and all kinds of things, because they understand that it's important to understand who you are, what is the context that you exist in. And then I think there's a third thing that really is impactful and interesting, and that is, this expression, I think it's associated mostly with Obama, that you want to be on the right side of history, right? And this is, of course,
except these people have rejected history outright.
Yes,
so, like, how?
Yes. I mean, but this is based on this is based on a very sort of Marxist view of, like, that history has this trajectory, and it's sort of, when it starts moving in the other direction, that's just a temporary mistake, because history will just go in this sort of leftward direction all the time, and where the people who were more on the right, they will be seen as the bad guys. They will be seen by history as the bad guys, and no one wants to be seen as the bad guys. So you better just get on the right side of history. So you're on team good, right? Well, if we actually look at it, at which direction society is going, at what's happening in society, where it's just a disaster. Our cities are burning, children are being raped, old people are afraid to go out. Our society is simply collapsing. It's simply being completely destroyed, massacred. And it's very obvious that by future generations, the people who are responsible for this disaster, they will be seen as criminals. The architects of multiculturalism will be seen as despicable criminals. They destroyed an entire civilization. When they started out with their project, with their multiracial mass immigration project after the Second World War, this has just happened in a few decades. When they started out, pretty much everyone in the West thought that my children will have a better life, will grow up in a better society than I did. They will have a better life. Now, no one believes that. No one can say with a straight face that my children will grow up in a better society than my parents grew up in. No one will say that. It's obvious that they're destroying society. It's obvious for everyone involved. And I think more and more people are realizing that, that these multiculturalists, they are on the wrong side of history. They will be seen as villains. And when people start realizing that, maybe we're sort of starting to be seen as criminals here, they'll start jumping ship. They will abandon the project, and only the most insane people will remain on board. But yeah, I think there are many forces just pushing things in our direction, and proving us right. But it's a long process, and this is my core message: is that there is no quick fix. This is not an issue for an election. This is an issue for a paradigm shift, and it's a marathon. It's not a short-term solution. It's a long-term thing, and we're probably not going to see any massive results in our lifetimes. It may take a couple of generations, but that is why the fundamentals are important. That is why the paradigm is more important than the specific details and statistics. The paradigm of values is more important, and that's a cultural issue. That's why I'm focused so much on culture, because those are the real big issues. And we're starting small, but I think that's where the most important work is to be done.
Excellent. Well, I'll respond to that, but I'm sensitive to keeping you for too long here. I want to ask people, if you have a little bit more time, I want to just ask the people in the chat to ask questions if they have any before we let you go. Is that all right?
Sure.
Okay. Well, then, please, people who are listening, if you have any questions for Fróði, please plug them in, but put an @Semiagog in front of them so that I can see them clearly in the chat here. And we'll ask him a few questions and then allow him to wrap up. I want to make sure that people who've been following this do have a chance to throw questions your way. Yeah, in terms of the history, while we're waiting for some of those to come through, I'll just make one observation. It just has occurred to me time and again that this idea of linear progress, you mentioned, the idea of progress, and, history is this, this sort of chorus off to one side of the tragedy that we're all acting in, that, sings and squawks in a particular way, positive or negative at different points, depending on our behavior. And this is very much on my mind because Academic Agent just did a little clip where he was talking about models of history, that are not necessarily distinct, but there's like linear and cyclical and paradigm shifts and, a Hegelian thesis, synthesis, antithesis, and some other ones. Marxist, which is frankly just Hegelian, turned upside down, as they say. One of the things about this idea of progress, which just drives me crazy, it's one of the most insidious, obnoxious things about it, is the way in which it's been turned to the purpose of justifying the status quo. First off, evolution is something that, whether or not originally intended by the scientists, it's come to suggest, incremental developments that are definitely positive is up at the top and negative is below, right? Because there's this, I guess it was Spencer who said it is, and really Darwin, but the idea of the survival of the fittest, and if it exists today, it must because it was most fit, right? The simple fact that it is here is an indicator that it's the most fit. Those other things that have disappeared, that, for example, we ripped up by their roots, kind of like the communists yanking Catholic nuns out of their graves in Spain. We dug them up by their roots, that's been thrown on the trash heap of history. And it must have happened because, well, whatever survived must have been the fittest. And the arc that we're describing is always evolution, which is a development in a positive direction. All these assumptions that are just preposterous, but the most insidious of them is the unexplored assumption that if it continues to exist and exists now and has supplanted anything in the past, then that which we are confronted with here, as I said, it's defense of the status quo and nothing else, other than perhaps a lever to justify all sorts of insane, experiments that suit the utopians. But that's something that came to mind when you were talking about this arc of history. Let me see if we have some questions here, and I will run them by you. Now, feel free to take to drop or reject, as suits you. I'll just pass them on directly. One of them is from Betwixt. It says, "What is your opinion of Ireland today?" I'm assuming that is a question from the perspective of nationalism.
Well, I can't say a whole lot about that. I don't know too much about Ireland, about what's going on. I'm surprised to see how crazy things are in Ireland. I thought that it was spared in terms of mass immigration to a greater extent. I've actually never visited Ireland. So I don't really know. I don't know what's going on. I don't know in terms of if there's any meaningful opposition to the destruction there. I don't know much. It's horrible. It's outrageous to see this boy being stabbed, for example. Everyone saw that a few months ago, and that was everywhere, and they tried to suppress it, the media, of course. And it's dishonest, it's disgusting, and more people are seeing it. But yeah, I don't know what's going on in Ireland.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, your ancestors used to go there to pick up slaves all the time, so it was apparently a great spot for y'all to visit and drag them back to like Vestmannaeyjar in Iceland or whatever. Apparently,
Yeah.
they're good for digging ditches for you. But all joking aside, sorry for the Irish folks in the house. Maybe I don't know much about it either. Maybe check with, there's a guy, his channel is called Cassius, and he seems to sympathize with nationalism, and he's based in Ireland. You can catch him on Twitter as well. Next one, this is from Turnip Merchant. I'm wondering if this is the same Turnip Merchant whom AA refers to as having gone to, quote, band camp. And if, in fact, it's the one that has done conducting, I'd love to have you on to discuss conducting, which as a set of metaphors for, dealing with human beings in a group, I just think is a rich vein to mine. Turnip Merchant asks, how do we rejuvenate society? No big ask for you to, in summary fashion, respond to that quickly.
How do we rejuvenate society? Yeah, I think this is something of what I talked about earlier. I think the spiritual aspect of it all. I think that when you go to the real fundamental questions about spirit and spirituality, what I mean by that is what gives meaning. So we have science, we have philosophy, we have, by that I mean, philosophy of language, more that kind of philosophy, academic philosophy. We have, all those kinds of things. But then we have the issues of values, meaning, definitely, questions of the numinous, the divine, if God exists or not exists. Even people who believe that God doesn't exist in a Christian sense or in any other sense, they still have values. So they still have these spiritual issues. And I do think that people are religious. You don't have to believe in God. You don't have to believe in anything divine. But I think it's obvious that human beings are religious creatures. And religion was just a part of, for example, it was in ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, it was a ritual that you participated in to be a part of society. So I do think that there will be a return of religion, a meaningful religion, and I think that will also sort of reinvigorate society. I think that we are going in that direction. I think people are tired of this nihilism. Because nihilism is like, it's funny for 5 minutes, and then it gets boring and horrible.
Whoops, sorry. I was unable to unmute my mic there. Yeah, absolutely. The only thing more tiresome than the nihilism is the irony. It makes me want to, just puke or stick knitting needles in my eyes. Okay. Sigurd Rathman says, Semiagog, how do we play the long game when the globalist technocratic control grid will be in place fully within one generation? I don't know how Fróði would answer that, but it seems to me that the success of these projects, not to mention, even if they are successful, who will be up in the control room, it's not as certain as everybody might imagine. But this is a question for you, Fróði.
Yes, this is a thing that many people who speculate in sort of a dystopian direction, they think that, I'm not accusing this person of thinking this, but the model of thinking is based on a sort of monolithic evil against us. That everyone on board on this project is just against us, and they will have total power, and there's nothing we can do about it. The point is, though, that we have hundreds of thousands of people listening to us and agreeing with us. And not all those people are janitors or street sweepers or, grocery clerks or something like that. A lot of those people are very wealthy. They are in top levels of the state. people on all levels will start agreeing with us more and more as time passes. I think that it will just, that our, I hate the word movement, but the current that we are a part of, it will only increase in quantity and in quality. And that means that people in all levels, even the top levels, will more and more start to agree with us. That's why I think that these dystopian models or sort of future projections, we have to I don't think that will happen that way, because I think many people will sort of join our cause.
Everyone will eventually recognize that what is best in life is to crush your enemies.
Yes.
See them driven before you. Yes. All right. This from Heinrich Nitschke. What are your thoughts on the National Justice Party?
I don't know. I saw Mike Enoch's opening speech. I mean, that's basically all I know about them. I don't know anything else about them, so I can't really say much about what they're doing. And that I don't know really what the project is about. I think it's very obvious that they're not gonna get a president elected from that party or anything. So they probably have some other plan with it. I don't know what that plan is. But I don't see any downsides of it. So yeah, I mean, I wish them the best.
Yeah, I don't know anything about it either. I agree with what Fróði just pointed out there, is without any sense of what it is they intend to do with it, it's impossible to make any judgment about their chances of success. So yeah, I agree. Okay, this one is from John Goris, the master of Ghost Tank cartoons and others. I recommend his channel, Ghost Tank, if you want to see people explode in puddles of gore and flying shattered bone. And yeah. Fróði, how did you hook up with Tai E? You guys work well together. Just for context, Tai E is someone who frequently is a guest on Fróði's channel for Guide to Culture, talking specifically about movies.
Yeah, I've known about Tai's channel, or his website rather. I mean, he writes film reviews, and now he does regular film conversations with me on my channel, Guide to Culture. So when I started Guide to Culture, I actually started with, I did mostly the shows with John Morgan, often with Tom Rousel, sometimes with a few other people, but they were sort of my regular guests. And then we stopped for a few months, really. And then it really took off with the Decameron Film Festival. And then one of my friends who knew Tai suggested I have him on. I'm not going to, say who it is in case he doesn't want me to say that. But so I had him on. We talked about The Tortoise King, and I think that was an absolutely brilliant episode. I think those kinds of obscure films are important to talk about. And the guy just he knew his stuff, and I enjoyed the conversation, and I wanted more conversations with him. So I said, and he also enjoyed the conversation. So we just decided to do a regular thing out of it, because he has, as he has told me many times, he can talk for an infinite amount of time about films. He can just go on and on and on. So it's enjoyable. So that's how it happened.
Yeah, I've caught a couple of them. I generally tune in more for the book ones, but I've come in for a couple of the film ones, and I can attest to that fact. He can talk about movies for as long as he draws breath. Yeah. Okay, there is, and interestingly so, I should add, I'm going to cut this with the 11D levity comment, and Fróði, just because this will doubtless go on forever. The next one that I have here, and please, answer as suits you, Fróði, if you want to, keep them shorter or whatever. One question: do you have a bug out bag?
No, I don't.
Okay. This from El Vaquero 555. He says, I believe a paradigm shift. Hello, sir, by the way. I believe a paradigm shift can happen rather rapidly in the face of catastrophic events. What are your thoughts on this? I would just observe. It seems like Fróði sort of touched on that, in the sense that we're about to ram headfirst into reality, in the sense that these expectations and presumptions about how things work are being increasingly proved wrong. But is there anything you'd want to add to that, Fróði?
Well, yeah, I mean, of course, it can happen more rapidly, at least the effects. But then it always takes a while for it to get sort of really entrenched, or how you want to put it. So, yeah, I mean, of course, outside events can make it happen more quickly. My only point is for bringing it up is that people need to start focusing on that. People need to start understanding the big game, the big picture and the long game, rather than focusing on the details and thinking that if we produce enough statistics, we will convince people and win them over. No, I think we need to change their worldview.
All right, thank you, and thank you for that, Elva Cara. This from Shell saying, I want to send you a video link for the African issue. I'm assuming that's addressed to me. If that's the case, you can stick a link in the comments down here, or you can get me with direct messages on Twitter. So yeah, but placing it in the comments, usually those come through. If not, I'll see them in the part that allows me to sift through comments before they post. Hopefully you'll be able to get them through. Doomer Tears says, Fróði, say something about Varg.
Yeah, well, I'm a huge fan of his music. I've been for a long time. When I was a teenager, I read a lot of his stuff on burzum.org, where he wrote about Nordic mythology, stuff like that. That was because I was also interested in Nordic mythology. Now he's he he gets carried away by his own fantasy, etc. But I think he is a creative genius. I think that he has, he has inspired a lot more people than most people think. So I think he has done some very important work. And then, yeah, his channel was something different than that. It was something unexpected from that gentleman. But yeah, he was important for me when I was a teenager. Definitely when I was, around 15 years old. I loved reading his books. He wrote at least one book in English, but a few in Norwegian, and yeah, the website that collected some of his articles, etc., and his music. I mean, it's yeah.
Okay, well, this one is from Boss Drive. It seems to me that committed Christians make up the bulk of dissident nationalist reactionaries. Given your view, what accounts for this?
That is not my impression. Maybe that has changed lately. Maybe that is true now. Usually, it has not been the case. Definitely not. If you look at the 90s, if you look at the early 2000s, if you look at the movement around William Pierce, who I think is brilliant, Revelo Oliver, all those people saw the same problems, but they didn't formulate the same things that I did, but they saw the same general problems. The post-war nationalist movement, white nationalist movement, has definitely has tended to have a very Nietzschean view on Christianity as a set of values. That is definitely my experience. Of course, when there is a mass immigration from Muslim countries, for example, the contrast becomes very clear. If they have a Muslim identity and people here, it is more permissible to have a Christian identity than to have a white identity. So maybe people choose that, in a sort of a wider movement, if that includes also the national populist, less ideological parties, the bigger picture movement, that might include more Christians. But when it comes to the core, the meta-political paradigm shift movement that I'm a part of, that's definitely not my case. In the more ideological, intellectual movement, Christians are definitely a minority.
All right, excellent. Thank you. This one is from Nitschke again. I'll try to do this quickly. Fróði, do you worry about being in the dissident right? Are you worried about legal issues? I believe it's an issue for all of us. My short answer, and I'll turn it over to you, Fróði, is be prudent, obey the law, don't be an idiot, and recognize that your behavior has implications for everyone else who's trying to get things done in this space.
Well, I've already described in the show how I've had to deal with the law in terms of my conferences and people getting arrested, etc. But I make very clear that I don't want anything to do with people who behave, who are criminals or who advocate violence, anything like that. I don't want anything to do with them. I am. I hate the word intellectual. I mean, I'm a reluctant intellectual, I guess. I hate intellectuals as in a sense, but that is what I do. I work with ideas. I guess that defines an intellectual. So I guess yeah, I think the work I do doesn't have the legal implications of you know, I'm not involved in any activist group or anything like that. So of course there's always a risk of being a dissident, and Greg Johnson experienced that by being arrested. So there's always that, but I know that I'm not committing any crimes, and you know I'm sort of conspiracy theorist enough to think that the security services are keeping an eye on us 24/7, so they also know that I'm not committing any crimes.
Yeah, I take the same view. Everybody's like, "Oh, who's a spy? Who's a this?" I'm like, the only rule of thumb that anybody should be imagining is not who's a spy; it's who's not. And just assume that everything has been plowed over back and forth in terms of every communication, all forms of data, all emails, you know, all book searches, all Google Map, you know, location points have all been, you know, plowed and replowed over and over again and cross-referenced. So it's kind of like, yeah. We're getting close to the end.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. I mean, I don't want any political power. I don't want a position. I don't want to be a leader of anything. I don't want any followers. I mean, followers, yeah, on social media and on YouTube and things like that. I want to communicate, but I mean, I don't want to be a leader of anything. I don't want to be that kind of person. I'm interested in ideas. I want to give my ideas to other people. And yeah, so I'm not very worried about that.
Yeah, I feel the same way. And you just said, you know, the shameful truth. You're, you know, an intellectual, you know, someone who's, you know, studying more scholarly stuff, academic stuff, and ideas and themes. You know, there it is. Be free to stare up into the sky and try to understand what makes the stars move. This from William Harris says, in Scandinavia, there is a group of nationalists called Den Nordiske Motstandsbevegelsen. I can't even.
Yeah, the Nordic resistance movement. Yeah.
What does Fróði think of them?
I actually don't know much about them. I mean, it's I know that they exist, and you know, I sometimes hear about them, but I don't really know them. I don't know anything about their activities, so I can't really comment too much about that.
Okay, not possible to comment due to ignorance of the subject. This one from Fasil Goose. How big?
Yeah, I mean,
player...
that ties in with. Yeah, sorry to interrupt you.
No.
That ties in with the previous question. They are, as far as I know, an activist organization. I'm not interested in that. So yeah, I mean, there's a clear distinction between what they do and what I do. So that's why I don't really know much about them.
Excellent, thank you. This from Fasil Goose, and we're 3 questions away from wrapping up here, I think. How big of a player is Sweden in space? And are there any indications of military capability in the Swedish National Space Agency, Swedish Space Corporation? Who are their space partners? Tiny little question there.
Space program, I have no clue.
Okay, well, that was easy. Sorry, Fasil Goose, you're going to have to let your fingers do the walking if you're old enough to remember that expression. And by the way, were you born in the 80s, Fróði, if you don't mind me asking?
Yes, I was.
Okay. That's about where I figured it. This one is from Betwixt. Semigog, this question is for you. Would you consider getting angry New Zealand's only real nationalist YouTuber onto your channel. I believe I've talked with him before, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's that in flagrans angelo, some bloody effulgence of flaming angel blood or something in Latin. Sure, send me a link. I think I've talked to him before, though. Jewel Citizen, question for Fróði. Which nationalist figure would you most like to speak at a future Scanza forum who hasn't attended thus far?
Okay, I have to come up with some good answer. I've basically had everyone on. I don't
Tough
know.
job, right?
That is a tough job. Okay, so who would I want who hasn't spoken before? I would like to have Jim Goad.
Right, and he's got that. I saw that link that you shared with some discussion. Isn't it a person from Sweden's coming to talk to him?
Yeah, from Norway. Yeah.
Oh, Norway. Sorry. Yeah, all you ice monkeys look the same to us, you know.
Yes.
But your flat bottom ships that can so quietly creep up our rivers and allow you to burn our cities and steal our gold and take our dark-haired women. Yes. Sorry. Joking aside, let me get back over here to the last question here, which I decided we would cut at 11 levity. And this is it's kind of a sort of a black pill ending question, but perhaps Fróði can find a way to bring some hope to the picture. How are parents in Sweden dealing with the issue of keeping their kids safe?
I think many of them are just moving away from the bad areas. I think that's basically all you can do. And because homeschooling isn't an option really in Sweden, it's basically not allowed. So I think the only thing they can do is to move away from the bad areas. And that's what I would recommend that they do as well, because if you have children and you live in a bad part of the country, there's nothing you can do to protect your kids. You can't walk around with them all the time, 24/7. You have to just live in an area where you feel that you're safe. And there's no shame in moving away from the bad areas. Your top priority, if you're a parent, is to protect your kids. So, yeah.
Very good. Well, perhaps they will, retreat to gather their strength and recapture their territory, so to speak, metaphorically speaking, you understand me. Culturally recapture the hearts and minds of the population, let us say, to avoid too much controversy. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you all for being here. I hope that all of you, I would love to see like a whole pack of number ones appear in the chat right about now to thank Fróði for being here. To thank him for patiently waiting, since there was a mix-up on my part about the start time. He very graciously stuck it out. And just generally thank him for the work he's doing and for having been a guest on this channel. I certainly do thank you, Fróði, very much. And I want to, again, enjoin people who are watching to go over to Scanza Forum, subscribe. Go over to Guide to Culture, subscribe. You can do it on YouTube. You can do it on BitChute. On BitChute, frankly, there is no damn reason in the world why he should have the number of subscribers that he does. It should be way up. I'm serious. Go check it out. If you're not aware of the content, you'll see that he has all kinds of great people on and great discussions. So again, subscribe. And do you want to say anything? You told me about a little project that you had underway. I don't want to do a reveal on it if it's too early. But I thought I'd throw it out there. Maybe you could tease the public with it. Perhaps I've gone too far. I hope not.
Well, I have many projects, but I think I'm going to keep a lid on the thing you're thinking about. But I just want to thank you for, I've really enjoyed this conversation. I enjoyed having you on the show last time and during the Cameron Film Festival, and I hope that we can do this again in the future. And we talked about the book that we're probably going to talk about later on. But yeah, I mean, there are many books, but we should definitely do shows again in the future. And if anyone wants to find my work, I think the best thing is you can follow me on Twitter, real_GTK, or guidetoculture.org. So thank you so much for watching, and thank you for having me on the show.
It's been my pleasure. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thanks again to all of you. I hope we'll see you again soon. Hopefully we'll see Fróði here at some point when the right topic comes up. Until next time, I am Semiagog, and I